I am managing editor for All About Jazz, which is a large internet site devoted to jazz, and I spend a lot of time actually in Norway in particular. As some of my friends here know, I've got a particular interest in what's going on here and trying to figure out exactly why in a country with 5 million people there is just so much creative music happening. And coming to Trondheim has been a bit of a pilgrimage for me as well, because I've heard about the conservatory here for many, many years, long before I started coming. And so the actual opportunity to go there when I first arrived and listen to the students with Eric Johansen rehearsing some of the music for this pop group from the 60s, which I didn't know, called Difference, was pretty exciting. Just to get a feel for the kind of approach that the conservatory takes to education and why perhaps it succeeds more than others in engendering creativity. But meanwhile, being asked about talking about the road ahead for jazz and improvised music, one of the first things I actually thought about was the early days of myself and my wife of 22 years. Rio is an Irish Catholic, lapsed. I'm a Jewish boy, lapsed. And we spent a lot of time in the early days talking about the differences between being raised Catholic and being raised Jewish. And, you know, I'll give you one quick insight into the Jewish one with a joke. What's the difference between an Orthodox Jew, a conservative Jew, and a Reformed Jew? The Orthodox Jew has 2 sets of dishes, one for milk and one for meat, because that's what kosher demands. You don't mix them. Reformed Jews have 1 set of dishes because they don't really care, and conservative Jews have 3, one for milk, one for meat, and one for Chinese. And it is the truth. That's how I grew up. But the real thing is that, you know, speaking to the different pluses and minuses of growing up either Catholic or Jewish, on one hand, you have, of course, the absolute dogmatism of Catholicism. There's one guy defines how things are, and if you're a card-carrying and devoted Catholic, you follow these rules, and that's how it is. And, you know, the plus side is you know what things are. The minus side is if you don't happen to agree with them, then maybe you have a problem. On the other hand, with Judaism, you have an inherent freedom that has resulted in a religion so fractured that it's often really difficult to understand exactly what it is, if not how many dishes to buy. You know, there's choices between, you know, ultra-religious Hasidic Jews and non-traditional reformers, and many of them think that they're the ones who are Jewish and that the other ones aren't. It's very hard beyond a few basic tenets to really understand what being Jewish is and what it means. And it's something that we value, but on the other hand, if you're looking for a clear-cut path, it really is difficult. And jazz, of course, is faced with similar problems. On one hand, you've got dogmatists who think that jazz is really very easily definable by a narrow set of defining markers: African-American tradition, elements of swing and blues. On the other hand, you've got those who think of jazz as more of an aesthetic, perhaps, more of a spirit. Something is empirically difficult to define. For these folks, identifying jazz is kind of like the difference between identifying, an art film and pornography. I mean, sex in one and sex in the other. It's not always easy to define, but you know the difference. So in a time when jazz has become not just grist for serious and sometimes not so serious discussion, we have a lot of other issues at hand. For those that are concerned that jazz is in threat of extinction once gray hairs like me and no hairs finally depart this mortal coil, there's the question of whether the word jazz is actually harmful to its existence and to its future. Ask some young people about jazz and you'll get a knee-jerk reaction of, oh, I don't like jazz, or it's old folks music. This past year, there's been a lot of discussion in North America. Some of it's filtered here in 2 very different threads. One has been Nicholas Payton's whole BAM campaign, which was really more a marketing thing, as Francesco mentioned yesterday. But at its root, to make sure and confirm the Afro-American roots of jazz is not necessarily a bad thing. How he conducted it is questionable, but that's another story. But on the other hand, we have this thing that started in New York called the stretch movement. And this is by a bunch of young musicians who, after spending 4 years at various music schools in the United States, find themselves with student loans of about $200,000 and the very harsh reality that there is very little probability that they're actually going to pay those loans back, certainly playing jazz. And so what they're trying to do is they're trying to create a movement whereby they leverage the education, the language they've learned, the skills they've had into other kinds of music that maybe have a greater appeal. But, you know, I mean, at the end of it, you know, sometimes we're arguing semantics, you know, is jazz really an old farts music? Is it really an impediment? Were the name to be changed? If you think of it, instead of calling it jazz, you call it BAM, or you have something that's called stretch movement that uses parts of it together. Is it jazz? Is it not? Does it really matter? More important on the subject of attracting new people to the music is really the more complex equation of reduced media attention and conversely more music being released on a monthly basis than ever before, as we've discussed. The maybe not such a bad plight of being a reviewer of having a bit embarrassment of riches. And yet sales continue to drop or remain at best flat. So we're not really going to solve that problem, but it is really a compelling one. Another thing that seems almost paradoxically inverse to the perception of jazz being under threat of extinction is indeed the number of young musicians studying it around the world. And you know, the number of festivals in the world. I mean, I heard last year, I think in Norway, 600 music festivals. They call it festival inflation here. And that's another sort of odd thing because, you know, Dave Holland, for example, can play to hundreds of thousands of people in a summertime of festivals, and yet he has a hard time selling 10,000 CDs, and I'm not exactly sure why that is. I know myself when I go to see a show, and if I really love the music, I have to go home with it. I have to be able to listen to it. But that seems to be not the way that everybody's thinking about it. But anyway, regardless, with festival work, it's work is work, income is income, and if the model is changing at how we make money as a musician, and if CDs have become indeed business cards more than actual income generators, or perhaps, as Dave Liebman's calls it, really more just a means of documenting where they are at a particular time. You know, it's, the reality is there really is plenty of work for a musician, at least it seems, during the festival season in countries like Norway and in Europe. Now, not all countries have funding for the arts that Norway does, and despite all the bitching in the US about funding, there does still seem to be no shortage of people looking to play this music. And a lot of them are far from being gray hairs and no hairs. Lots of young people playing jazz of various flavors, and if you just witness the emergence of groups led by relative youngsters like Mary Halverson, Marius Nesset, Willem Simcock, and Christian Scott, jazz does not seem to be really in a threat of extinction. While there are those who will argue that a dogmatic approach to defining jazz is essential to its survival, and that if you can't define some boundaries, then it ultimately becomes dilute and stops being jazz, perhaps it's my own upbringing that just leaves me wondering, why are we really worrying about that? And Erland talked to that yesterday, and I found that really compelling. And also the clip of Bill Evans talking about the idea of creating 1 minute of music in 1 minute. I mean, these are broader definitions that transcend what we consider as genre and these things, and it starts to get more to the heart of at least what jazz means to me as an aesthetic or as a spirit. And while it would be fairly a reductionist thing for me to suggest that the next statement is an empirical truth, it is fair to say that jazz, during its first 70 years or so, if one considers it to have begun around the beginning of the 20th century, another challenge is that jazz developed for many years in a relatively linear fashion. And I say that relatively is important. One movement tended to lead to another, even though there were side things, but you know, swing led to bebop, which sort of led to jazz, some free jazz, sometimes as a logical inevitability, sometimes as an actual revolt against. By the 1960s, though, we were already beginning to see fracturing and fragmentation of jazz. But still, it was a lot easier to chart and follow developments then because there was far less music being released on fewer labels, and it was possible to get on top of what was happening. The world was a bigger place, and so The pluses and minuses. We couldn't really know what was going on in Norway outside of hearing maybe a few artists coming on an internationally distributed label like ECM. And it meant that cross-cultural pollination that has really become such an explosive evolution or revolution in the past 2 to 3 decades was a lot easier to identify because there was a lot less of it happening. It was a lot less complicated world with larger distances, keeping musicians largely working in their own areas, and keeping a lot of music from reaching folks beyond a record label's geographic border, with the exception of a few, like I say, international distribution deals. Pan-cultural groups like Oregon, coming from the early 70s and stemming from the late 60s with Paul Winter Consort, though, were an example of an exception in the early 70s. But by the late 70s, a label like ECM was already experimenting liberally with bringing musicians together from diverse cultural backgrounds, resulting in groups where you could find a Norwegian drummer, a Norwegian saxophonist with Polish background mixed with German bassist and an American guitarist, or a Brazilian percussionist playing with an American percussionist who studied sitar with Indian masters, and another American whose interest in global music became so prevalent that it ultimately diminished his acumen on the instrument for which he first gained his recognition. I'm speaking, of course, of 2 groups, Solstice, with Jon Christensen, Jan Gabarek, Eberhard Weber, and Ralph Towner, and Cadona with Nana Vasconcelos, Colin Walcott, Don Cherry, 2 seminal groups that helped establish ECM's reputation as a boundary pusher, be sure, but also for some, with its pristine recording conditions and its eschewing of some of the very things that people felt defined jazz antichrist. And if only it were that easy, but the early innovations of labels like ECM pale in comparison to what's going on now, with the number of cross-cultural melanges endemic to 21st century jazz. Just a couple of weeks ago, Jazz Ahead in Bremen, you had the flamenco fusion of Benevent, Di Geraldo, and Pardo, Middle Eastern-centric levantasy, to more decidedly jazz-like groups like Marius Nesset's Golden Explosion and the Lighthouse Trio with Willem Tim Garland and SF Circus. But, even these performances that could be more easily pigeonholed as jazz incorporated elements from a broad range of cultures, whether it was Circus, who's an Israeli-born guy living in England in his pan-cultural percussion rig, or Garland's Spanish tinge via del Sol. At this year's Ottawa Jazz Festival, we're going to have the return of Tunisian oudist Anwar Braham's The Mark Trio with Dave Holland and John Sermon, another ECM concoction and really a true cross-cultural blend if ever there was one. But jazz is fracturing into a myriad of splinter elements, some of which bear a direct relationship to their American roots, and many others that don't, continues at an increasing and for some alarming rate. What here in Trondheim do Ambrose Kimyasir, Splash Girl, Alan Holsworth, Food, Kit Downs, and Petter Vetra have in common? And the answer is a great deal and perhaps very little. If we restrict jazz to stylistic parameters, to dogma, it becomes difficult to consider much of what the Jazz Festival programs. Even if we exclude the tangential and peripheral programming that's becoming an endemic part of festivals today just to maintain a bottom line that allows survival, it's still, even then, becomes very difficult to really pigeonhole what jazz is, and yet in a certain improvisational aesthetic, perhaps even a particular harmonic language, or maybe even an indefinable spirit that somehow links all these disparate things together, the music, as diverse as it is, still somehow falls under the larger rubric of jazz. And if indeed there are those who consider jazz to be dead or dying, my feeling is they're just clearly not looking hard enough. And for those who continue to feel married to jazz as an American tradition, that's fine, and we cannot forget that jazz began as an inclusionary music, though, at the turn of the 20th century. Even though it began in the States, it married European musical traditions to the spiritual music of the church, the music of Congo Square, where the slaves were allowed to congregate 1 day a week and make music and dance, and a whole lot more. Writers advise aspiring scribes to write what you know, and maybe shouldn't the same thing be allowed to apply to jazz? Play what you know. In other words, take the music of your culture, your upbringing, and somehow integrate that into an ever-expanding language that surrounds you. Does it make sense for an artist like Arva Henriksen to play jazz standards or music directly linked to the tradition? when his upbringing was more about things like Norwegian folk music and church and choir. And to a degree, the answer would be yes. To learn some of the language of the tradition, it makes sense to have some background. But to play it as part of his own music making, it doesn't really make sense. Excuse me. Arva did this recording of the Miles Davis Gil Evans classic Sketches of Spain with the Norwegian Wind Ensemble, with Maria Schneider invited to conduct. And what that really proved is that he can do it, but that in his general way of music making, he chooses not to. On German bassist Eberhard Weber's Stages of a Long Journey, you can hear him collaborating with Gary Burton, Marilyn Mazur from Denmark, and Jan Gabarek from here, swinging their asses off on an incendiary version of Carla Bley's Syndrome, in a way that we haven't heard Jan play in quite a long time. And what this really says is, despite their directions, can they do this? And the answer is they sure can, but do they choose to? And the answer is absolutely not. Instead, they've all found ways to imbue their music with their experiences and their surroundings. As musicians, we're most often a reflection of who we are, but we're also a reflection of where we are and when we are. And while a guitarist like Terry Ripdahl spent some of his formative years with George Russell, his own passion for classical music, stemming from seeing 2001: A Space Odyssey, like myself actually, is a stronger definer on an album like the soon-to-be reissued Odyssey from 1976, where a distinctive ability to create this multi-layered music with rubato lines floating above each other and over grooves like a house of cards is as much a function of his love of Ligeti as it is any other influences, and that makes it a very personal statement. Even on his most recent album, Crime Scenes, with the Bergen Big Band, he's written music that is both of the tradition and beyond it. And just as his music somehow reflects his home on the Molde Fjord, Epla Trio's recent music reflects the calming zen of millennial forest in Norway. But for me, growing up in the 70s was a really good experience. One value about being as old as I am is that, you know, and if I wish I'd been born a few years earlier just so I could have seen Coltrane and Miles firsthand in that time. But it was great because at that time it seemed like anything was possible. And if you look at the sort of explosion of things in the 70s with, you know, electric music and that, there was a lot going on. And hear what was happening with people like Gabarek and Harold Anderson and Terrier and these folks. But, you know, as the dissolution of the major labels has taken place over the last decade or so, and the creation of a DIY recording industry where anybody can make a record because the gear is affordable, and despite there being some flaws with that and some potential problems, in fact, I kind of feel these days that the possibilities of music are even greater than they were in the 70s. You know, people who look back at that time, you know, with fondness and sort of as halcyon days, I really think that it's happening now. And this is in defiance of, you know, the 80s emergence of the young lions in American jazz who, you know, were admittedly talented but maybe reductionist in their viewpoint, like Wynton, and whose effects are still being felt to some extent and are being referred to as the jazz police. The difference is that in the 70s, landmark recordings had a good chance of being heard by a lot of people because there was major label support getting it out there and there were major tours. Nowadays, truly groundbreaking and important music is actually happening, but often it sinks without a trace because it's just struggling to be heard. And even the young lions are changing their stance, at least to some extent. Marsalis has in recent years collaborated with guys like Eric Clapton and Willie Nelson, seeing the idea that maybe stretching beyond his previous reductionist view may have value. Collaborations with Jazz at Lincoln Center, spearheading projects honoring Ornette Coleman, who at the early days for him would have been a pariah, or doing John Coltrane's The Love Supreme. And you know, one of the things that I find curious is that a few years ago in Ottawa, Dr. Lonnie Smith played, and after playing about 20 minutes of some pretty cool stuff, he went in this tirade about how John Coltrane actually is singularly responsible for the death of jazz in clubs. So there are a lot of people with a lot of different opinions, some of them positive, some of them not so positive. But at the end of it, clearly defining what jazz is and therefore how it can continue into the future you know, it's colored by personal bias and in some cases narrow-mindedness and maybe less than fully informed viewpoints, but it's very complicated. Speaking to many of the musicians who are playing the music though, you talk to people like Bill Frisell or to somebody like Mary Halverson, and while they'll acknowledge a connection to jazz in a general level, if they're asked what they play as jazz, their response isn't much different than mine, and does it really matter? Many of the musicians that I encounter, you know, will argue with some of what I'm saying, but you know, most of them seem to be concerned these days with really what's in a name. And more important than the name, though, for the future of jazz is how can it retain relevance and a place in a world where there are more things competing for people's attention each and every day, from video games to anything starting with a lowercase I. The hundreds of CDs I review or I receive for review consideration every month are just a fraction of what's being put out. You know, on one hand we have digital downloads and thankfully the increasing availability of high-speed wire and wireless connections that are finally making it possible for downloads not to be synonymous with compressed and lo-fi. On the other hand, we have seen a resurgence in vinyl, and beyond any romantic notions about its, you know, whether it's better or worse, an idea that Carl Sagan told me a few years ago, which is the idea that, you know, putting an album on makes the act of listening to music an actual active engagement again. You have to get up, put the thing on the platter, put the needle in the groove, you have to go sit down, 20 minutes later you got to go back and flip it and do the same thing. And that to me is actually a pretty profound statement. Vinyl puts the decision-making process back into the experience of listening to music, and I think something that's been talked about already this week is a critical thing, especially at a time when large volume digital storage media, multi-disc players, shuffle and repeat buttons make listening to music really a passive thing. And you know, where unless you really want it to be otherwise, it's just a matter of hitting the repeat button and sitting down and having hours ahead of you. The idea of vinyl making music a more active thing can't be anything but a good thing. And I'm not actually an advocate of vinyl in a particularly big way. I think it has a place, but you know, equally there are negatives. The real issue about vinyl for me is that you can do with it in the digital format what you do in vinyl if you make a conscious effort to do so. One of the other problems with digital media and all these buttons we have to press is that it allows us to be impatient and make split-second critical decisions. If we don't like the beginning of a piece, we can just quickly jump to the next track rather than take the time to listen to it and maybe contextualize it within the music surrounding it. Simply because, you know, if it was on a vinyl, we might not do that because we're a little bit too lazy to have to get up, go, and move the needle again. Musicians and producers spend a lot of time laboring over the sequencing of records. And while it's easy to gloss over things that don't appeal to us instantly, you know, we sadly just go ahead and do it, and we sometimes miss out on exactly what those folks are trying to communicate to us. Sometimes music only makes sense when you hear what comes before and what comes after. And that requires patience, which seems to be a bit of a hard thing to come by these days. So what does this all have to do with the road ahead for jazz? Well, and for its relevance. There is no doubt in my mind jazz will continue to exist. There's just too much of it being made by too many people. And the number continues to grow, with trade shows like Jazz Ahead experiencing incredible growth, 35% one year, 40% the next. And it's demonstrating there's no shortage of people involved in all aspects of music making. But the question is, how it will survive, that's the question. A number of things need to happen, but perhaps most importantly, the industry needs to become more technologically savvy. That's one of the things that I see working with All About Jazz, and more engaged in new media opportunities. Back home, when we compare the jazz industry in the United States with, you know, admittedly larger pop markets, from artists to labels, managers to publicists, it's a much older school mentality that is not prepared to embrace new technology and the opportunities that that technology provides to help get the music filtering up into people's consciousness. The truth that other more popular genres have embraced this from an online publications to online shop fronts, from high quality, even master level downloads to social media. These are essential things to jazz's survival, and the only way we're going to get it filtering into people's consciousness. There are other issues, of course, and this is not that simple, and there's no simple solution, otherwise we'd already be there. But I think that the idea of utilizing technology and social media is an essential factor. It was really encouraging for me, talking about gray hairs and no hairs though, when I made my first trip to Molde in 2009, I was at a show at Huntsville playing, and there was a young guy beside me, and we started talking, and it was a little surprising to me when I introduced myself, and I not only learned that he'd been reading my reviews, and that was very nice, but was that this 20-year-old who actually met here last night, he's studying here now, has been like collecting everything released on Ruta Gramophone, which is certainly not a label for the faint of heart, and certainly not what I expected from somebody who was 20 years old. We've actually stayed in touch, and this guy is running 3 festivals now. And one of the things I've learned in the ensuing years is he's not alone. Jazz and improvised music is reaching younger people, but we have to understand the what, where, why, and how in order to leverage that. And that's one of the things that I find, at least in festivals in North America, that we're more often than not failing at, is trying to understand what it is that is going to appeal to a younger demographic. And that's not to say there isn't a problem making jazz palatable to these younger ears. In the US, mass media has relegated jazz to college radio at best, and to the back pages of generalist print media with draconian length restrictions. And I don't want to paint a totally black and white picture, but one of the reasons I enjoy coming over here is I feel more that culture is an accepted norm, and back home in Canada as well, that it's a bit of a dirty word on a larger scale. If New York was for the longest time the jazz mecca, as Stewart has sort of addressed in his book, it really is now only a mecca, and is joined by other places in the world like Oslo, and even a place as small as Trondheim with a conservatory like this, and a tremendous orchestra, the Trondheim Jazz Orchestra, who I've seen in so many contexts. What clubs haven't dried up in the States, though, are not paying the musicians, or they're doing this paying for the hat or playing for the door. And the clubs that do pay are institutions like the Village Vanguard that are only hiring big-name artists and charging big bucks to bring them in. So these are more challenges. But that said, New York still is a mecca. There's something very special about it. You step out of Penn Station into Manhattan and there's an instant palpable buzz that can't be denied. And it's part of what's made the city a mecca for the jazz that it is. But we do have to get past the parochial views of music. And while the dogmatic nature of Catholicism makes it a less than abnormal way to view jazz in the 21st century, Catholic with a lowercase c as an adjective, widespread and universal prevalence, is perhaps a really worthy goal for jazz and improvised music. That and an acceptance of an interpretive nature predicated on infusing a growing vernacular with the specific languages coming from countries around the world. We need to embrace change, diversity, and inclusion in jazz rather than fighting it. America was the breeding ground for jazz, but no longer owns it. The folks who continue to insert jazz as some rigidly defined parochial music need to get over it. Jazz has been a global concern for decades. It's a factor that grows every year. Call it BAM, call it stretch, call it jazz, call it anything you like. Where this music is going is really up to us. Events like this are great for discussion and education, but we need to act, embrace the changing landscape of how the music is promoted, how the music is acquired, act to use technology the same way that more popular genres have done, act to ensure that while jazz may never achieve its one-time place as massively popular music, there is still every reason to believe that large numbers of people committed to this music will ensure, in and of themselves, the survival of this music, whatever you want to call it, and however you want to define it. Thanks.